It was a little over 2 years ago that I was first introduced to this wonderful congregation. Back in the winter of 2021, we were all in the midst of that thing. You remember it? COVID, right? And while most church communities were either in hibernation or at best in survival mode, one of the things that truly impressed me about this congregation was how active you were, how connected and engaged you were in the process of making some major changes. It was during this time that you came together, despite all the separations of the pandemic, to boldly envision a path forward to becoming something different than you had been before. Discussions and discussions and discussions, and finally votes were taken. Votes to let go of the historic name of your church, and then to adopt an entirely new name, approve a new covenant, and call your first new settled minister in over 3 decades. Now, shortly after I arrived here at All Peoples in the summer of that year and began serving you, I remember a conversation I had with one long-term church member. After a service one Sunday, this person pulled me aside and said to me, Bruce, I really like what's happening around here these days. But I have to tell you that sometimes it does not feel like my church anymore. Now, this person was not passing judgment on me or our board of trustees or on anyone else. They were not complaining or critiquing. They were just honestly expressing the way that all the change that had been taking place was making them feel. I really appreciated this person's sincerity, and I kind of knew how they felt. Moving to a new city and coming to serve an entirely new church with all of its long-standing traditions and history, while we were all still transitioning through a pandemic, was a lot of change for me to take in, too. I thanked this person for being so honest, and I assured them that they were not alone in feeling challenged by change. Afterwards, I could not help but think about how that person's statement, saying, "Sometimes it doesn't feel like my church anymore," is a sentiment that has been repeated over and over again by members of our churches since the very beginnings of Unitarian Universalism. And this is because we are, and we have always been, a religion that is constantly evolving and growing and changing. We truly are a religious movement made up of people who take the search for truth and meaning seriously and do our best to remain open to new ideas. 2 centuries ago, to be a Universalist or a Unitarian meant that you were a liberal Christian, using reason and Enlightenment philosophy to interpret traditional scriptures, and finding a loving and always forgiving God in the teachings of Jesus. By the end of the 19th century, it might have meant that you had begun to embrace the experiential spirituality of transcendentalism, or the ethical religion preached by Theodore Parker. Then the theories of Charles Darwin, the discoveries of scientists and medical researchers, and the societal changes caused by the Industrial Revolution all began to creep into the Unitarian and the Universalist consciousness, eventually bringing with them a dramatic shift towards religious humanism, leading many UUs to focus less on God and more on goodness, more on our shared responsibilities to one another. In the past half century, our theological evolution has incorporated teachings from pagan and earth-based sources, Native American traditions, feminist and womanist spirituality, Black liberation theology, and a host of practices and ideas from many of the great religions of the world. And at every step along this journey, from the 1800s to this very day, as dominant shared identities have emerged and then dominated and then dissipated, there have always been people within our congregations who have honestly spoken up and said, sometimes it does not feel like my church anymore. Being a Unitarian Universalist means being part of a religion which affirms at its core that revelation is continuous. So there is always more wisdom to be found, new ideas to encounter, ideas that can and may transform us personally and collectively at any time. Throughout our history, this has led to efforts to create statements which express our shared identity as religious people amidst our blessed diversity and our evolution. The early Universalists adopted the Winchester Profession in 1803, affirming their belief in universal salvation. As open-minded folks, this statement included what is known as the Liberty Clause, allowing for differences of opinion on theological matters. Many early Unitarians used the declarations made by William Ellery Channing in his famous Baltimore Sermon of 1812 to define their emergent liberal Christian identity. Half a century later, a Unitarian named William Channing Gannett produced a statement of faith called Things Commonly Believed Among Us, which was distributed widely and debated even more widely. And in the early 1900s, both Unitarian and Universalist authors created covenants, including the famous words of Griswold Adams, which began with, "Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer." When the Universalists and the Unitarians consolidated or merged in 1961 to form our one collective religion, delegates from our congregations across the country came together and voted to adopt a set of principles, purposes, and sources, which became a part of the bylaws of the new Unitarian Universalist Association. Now, it may surprise you to know that that version of our UU principles looks pretty much nothing like the UU principles that many of us are familiar with today. And that is because they were majorly overhauled and rewritten in 1984 by a group elected by our General Assembly. This group was largely led by UU women and resulted in the statements, for the most part, that we know today. You've probably heard them said, or maybe seen them written somewhere around this church. Maybe you even know some of them by heart. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the use of the democratic process, the goal of world community, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Now, this statement that was put together in 1984 also included a list of 5 sources that inspire us, from personal experience and prophetic people to wisdom from the world's religions to humanist teachings, reason, and science. A review of this portion of our UU Association bylaws was conducted again in 1995 and led to the addition of a sixth source, spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. Another organized attempt to reword our principles and sources took place back in 2008. And that proposal was narrowly voted down by representatives from our congregations. And you may recall that a grassroots movement that started in 2008 succeeded in having many of our congregations, including us here at All Peoples, vote to adopt an eighth principle, adding one more on top, to explicitly outline our commitments to work to dismantle racism and build multicultural community. And of course, a little more than a year ago, members of this church began leading an effort to add Islam to our UU list of sources, a proposal that we approved here last May and is moving forward throughout our denomination. All of this brings us to today. All that change from the past leads to right now. And it's interesting because our UU sources, our UU principle statements, have pretty much remained mostly unchanged, with the exception of a few additions, for almost 40 years. In the agreement which binds us together with other UU congregations as part of a larger movement, it was actually spelled out in writing that every 15 years or so, we are supposed to, intended to, directed to, engage in a process to revisit the way that we express our shared identity and the core values and principles that define us. So, the time to do that has come around once again. And over the past year, a commission within our UU Association has held numerous gatherings and discussions with people from church members from every state. Any of you all here today been part of any of those discussions? I know a few of us have. A few. Well, what that has led to is the creation of several drafts of potential revisions that are being put forward for all of our consideration. The most recent working proposal was published this past January and will be up for the first of two votes at our UU General Assembly in June in Pittsburgh. And this is kind of what it looks like. Brody, you want to show them that? There it is. That's the visual that goes along with this proposal. And the current proposal, the new language goes like this. It says, as Unitarian Universalists, we covenant to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, our shared values are interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. We covenant to cherish earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. With humility and reverence, we acknowledge our place in the great web of life, and we work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Pluralism. You can go back to that one. It's the same list, Brody. There you go. Pluralism. Pluralism, we celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and our commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systematic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make our decisions. Transformation. We adapt to a changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Never complete, never perfect. Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. And the last of our shared values, equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Now, this draft goes on to state, and this is the next slide, as Unitarian Universalists, we use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us to live into our values. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which they were created and are currently practiced. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. Grateful for the religious ancestries we inherit and the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. A whole bunch of people spent a whole lot of time putting that together. And I have to tell you that in considering all of this, and in looking around at our world today, it can be tempting to think that with our climate in crisis and escalating natural disasters bringing mass suffering to all corners of our earth, that with our American democracy in such dysfunction and under constant threat of unraveling altogether, that with trans kids here in Kentucky being dehumanized and gun violence invading our schools, with racism and anti-Semitism destroying lives each day right here in Louisville, it can be tempting to conclude that spending our time and our energy on wordsmithing the bylaws of our denomination, spending our time and our energy engaging in debates and discussions over these principles, maybe that's a luxury that we cannot afford. There are those who feel that all of this is just a distraction from the vital work of activism, resistance, service, and community building that we are called to be actually doing. Now, quite honestly, I'm not sure if I agree or disagree with that assessment. But I do think it's something for us to think about as we consider how much energy we're going to spend talking and considering this. I'm also not quite sure that I agree or disagree with all the new language and the new ways of interpreting our core values and principles that have been put forward. There are parts of that that I love. That seem to really resonate with me. There are also others that I'm a little bit dubious about. Much of our past principles, the things that I have grown to know and love, are still in there, for sure. And placing love at the center of all of our core values, saying that love is what connects us all together, seems right on target to me. In some ways, this new language seems a lot more centering and less mechanical than those old principles we had. In other ways, I don't know, in some ways, maybe it's too general and not specific enough. What I do know is that we are in the midst of a process of ongoing dialogue between Unitarian Universalists all across our nation. I also know that this proposal is likely to be edited and to be changed as it moves through meetings and discussions at our UU General Assembly this year and next year. Making these kinds of changes is not a foregone conclusion, nor is it being dictated to us from some higher authority. It is really an opportunity, I think, to be in conversation, to be talking about those questions of who are we, what are we doing here, and why are we doing it? It is meant to be an open process that involves vigorous discussion and heartfelt debate, a process that, if it's going to work, needs to include everyone, including and especially you. Today at 12:45 here in our sanctuary, we will be having an informal gathering for those of you who are interested in learning more and exploring about this a little bit further. And we're going to have a lot of additional opportunities to engage in this process, both in person and online, in the weeks and in the months to come here at All Peoples. So please be on the lookout for those. All of this brings me back to that statement that I heard. Sometimes it does not feel like my church anymore. Amid all of the change that is happening around us, within us, and among us, for better and sometimes for worse, it is always tempting to want what is familiar, to want what we already know to remain with us. Yet, our understanding that we are part of a religion that has always been defined by an evolution in our ways of thinking and believing, knowing that new and different ideas bring with them opportunities for growth. Maybe that understanding and that knowledge can lead us to say, hey, imagining new ways of expressing what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. That feels exactly like my church. That is who we are and what we do. Perhaps this process can help us feel that more than ever, we are in the right place. We are part of creating this congregation along with others. And we are here finding meaning together like never before. So may it be. And amen.